Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's disputation. My name is Rick Barry, and I am Assistant Professor of Theology. This is the fifth disputation that's been held by the Disputatio Project, which is an initiative of the Humanities Program. This event has two simultaneous purposes. First, to introduce you to the great Dominican tradition of disputation, and to suggest ways in which this approach remains important for the modern world. Second, we will have an opportunity to participate in a lively disputation with our two awesome guests, Dr. David Embrick and Mr. Coleman Hughes. Before introducing our speakers, I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about what we're doing today. So this portion of the event will take about 5 minutes, just so you know. If this is your first disputation at Providence College, I just want to explain to you a little bit more about what a disputation is and some of the history behind it. If you've read our college's mission statement, you might have noticed a surprising line. The mission statement says that we, quote, encourage a pedagogy of disputed questions. In other words, the style of teaching and research that is especially encouraged at Providence College is the disputed question. But what is the disputed question, and why is it so important here at PC? The reference to disputed questions in our mission statement is an acknowledgement of our deep Dominican roots. As you probably know, PC is the only college in the United States administered by the Dominican friars. And disputation is one of the hallmarks of Dominican education going all the way back to the 13th century. Classrooms in the Middle Ages were extraordinarily lively, especially at Dominican schools. Each week, students would learn from the teacher the key principles of a field through lectures, and then engage in exciting, playful disputations where they would go back and forth raising challenging objections to the key ideas presented and responding to those objections with the best arguments they could muster. The conviction undergirding this method was that one only really appreciates a topic when they grappled with the best arguments on either side of the issue. Disputation is a form of intellectual hospitality. In the words of our mission book, this method is a mode of pursuing truth that seeks out the strongest arguments from all interlocutors. It is not afraid to hear the objections of the conversation partner. In fact, it's confident that by squarely facing and responding to objections, our knowledge of the truth, our love of the truth, can be strengthened. In a way, a great disputation is a laboratory for ideas, where we test our thinking to see how well our claims hold up when interacting with alternative viewpoints. So, how did disputations actually work? In the medieval period, the conversation would be organized to allow participants to explore a shared question and to go back and forth with objections and responses on either side of the question. Then the exercise would culminate in what's called the determination, at which point a professor would give his measured assessment of the question, drawing on the strongest points articulated on each side. As you know, the motto of Providence College is Veritas, truth, and it has been a conviction of the Dominican order from its foundation that the method of disputed questions is one of the most powerful tools we have in pursuit of the truth. In fact, steadfast and joyful commitment to this method may be more necessary today than ever. That's why the Disputatio Project exists, and that's why we're having this event today. One final note. It's important to say at the outset that we come together at this table certainly not as opponents, but as partners on the way to truth, and hopefully ultimately as friends. By presenting their best arguments on either side of the question, our speakers today will help us to think deeply and rigorously about a crucial question, so that we owe them both our most sincere appreciation. The question we are discussing relates to something crucial that we all must consider. The question is, would it be just for America to pursue a colorblind society? In any disputation, it's important to be attentive to the words of the question. This question has at least 4 important elements. I should put it on the screen. Four important elements, 4 keywords. First, the word America. We are grappling with this question in an American context, and that means a context of a shameful history of devastating racism and injustice, and also in the context of a nation founded with high ideals for equality and liberty. Our question asks what we should pursue in that particular context. Second, notice that word pursue. This question is asking for a vision worth pursuing together. It is ordered toward an end, a telos. Where should we go? Third, notice the word just. What is justice, and what does it require from us? A classic definition from the Catholic tradition says that justice disposes one to respect the rights of each person and to establish in human relationships the harmony that promotes equality with regard to persons and to the common good. That might seem like a pretty good definition, but what does it demand from us in this concrete area? Fourth, and by the way, that's the statue of Lady Justice that you walk by whenever you come into Rouen here. It's outside our doors, and she's holding a sword, which represents authority, and a book, which has the scale, which represents fairness, kind of implying that one can also find justice through studying the great books. And the fourth word is colorblind. As we listen today, listen to hear how each presenter defines that word and how they assess whether it is a worthy and just goal in an American context. So, with all that in mind, I'm thrilled to introduce our two speakers. Dr. David Embrick, on the left here, is an associate professor in sociology and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut. He is also the director of the Research on Resilient Cities, Racism, and Equality at UConn, and past president of the Association for Humanist Sociology. He has published widely and is the editor of numerous books, including most recently, Protecting Whiteness, Whitelash, and the Rejection of Racial Equality. Dr. Embrick's research is centered largely on the impact of contemporary forms of racism on people of color. Joining him today is Mr. Coleman Hughes. He's a prolific writer whose work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and many other publications. Mr. Hughes once attended the Juilliard School to study jazz trombone before dropping out to pursue a career as an independent jazz and hip-hop artist. He has studied applied ethics and public policy at Columbia. Today he is the host of the podcast Conversations with Coleman, and his forthcoming book is entitled The End of Race Politics: Arguments for a Colorblind America. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers. Again, the question I've asked is as follows: would it be just for America to pursue a colorblind society? Mr. Hughes will take the yay position to this question, and Dr. Embrick will take the nay position. On the screen, you can see the time limits for the 3 rounds that we will have. Throughout the debate, please prepare questions to ask the speakers. There's an online form that you can use to submit questions, and so you can use the QR code that's right at your spot, hopefully. I'll also have a QR code that I can put on the screen later to submit questions whenever they come to you. And now I invite Dr. David Embrick to the podium for his opening remarks.
Good afternoon. I wanted to say that I'm very pleased to be invited here to have a conversation with all of you and with Mr. Coleman. I am a bit intimidated because I don't have the radio voice, nor am I in a jazz band, so I feel like I'm in a severe disadvantage here in terms of that, for real. It's interesting because I was talking to Mr. Coleman earlier. I think we had a great conversation, short-lived but great. And I think that, I think it's hard for some of these questions to have a real yay or nay position, right? So I'm going to start off with that, right? So even though I'm the nay, I think the answer to the question, or my position, is that it really depends. right? Because I think the question is a bit more complicated than the way that it's framed, right? And so it's and complicated in a way that makes it hard to answer with a simple yea or nay. That is, it's not whether we should pursue a colorblind society, but rather what would it take for us to get there? And even if it's in the realm of possibility to do so, given both the legacy and history of racism in the US and our current understanding of the US as a racialized social system, right? And I think this last part, understanding the United States as a racialized social system, is extremely important because it requires us, one, at least from a sociological vantage point, to separate out what we sort of have defined or think of as prejudice, which are individual acts, thoughts, and beliefs, from racism, which we sort of look at as institutional, structural, systemic. And we often conflate the terms, right? We think that prejudice and racism are the same. And when we do so, we're forced to think differently, though, about solutions to eradicate racism, right? So if you think about it, if you defined racism as individual acts, if you defined it as acts that people do, right? Then the solutions to eradicating racism are sort of centered on individual acts. So this is why you have a lot of times people talking about, well, we just wait. Let's just wait for people to get older and the next generation to come because the next generation is going to be more progressive. You know, let's talk about education as sort of the key, or maybe sometimes even the only key to sort of eradicating, right? These are all individual level answers. And I'm not saying that talking about prejudice isn't important. I think it's only part of the equation, right? So thinking about the fact that racism is embedded in myriad ways in our society is an important acknowledgement because it centers on the just or the justice part of the question, which is different than asking if it's worth pursuing a colorblind society. If I didn't think it was worth pursuing a society in which race no longer mattered, I probably would not have pursued a career as a racism scholar. And that's just the truth. So this reminds me of a question I was asked a long time ago during my prelims in graduate school, and it was really centered around the idea or the thought, or what did I think about some of the scholarship that contended that racism was inevitable and such a pursuit of the eradication of racism required constant vigilance and attention, and that failure to do so would lead to increased racism, perhaps, right? So the idea was that if we look at racism, that it sort of continues. And so we have to constantly sort of be directing our attention to it, because if we fail to sort of center our attention on racism, that it would, and it continued unabated, that it would just get worse and worse and worse and worse, right? And I think that's a very cynical reading of racism, and I'd like to think that I'm skeptical, but I don't really want to be cynical. So, because what's the point then? So I think there is a way that we can sort of have a great conversation about what does it sort of look like to have a society one day, perhaps, right? And so again, I sort of rephrase that question as like, how do we sort of get there, and what do we do about sort of the legacy of racism that keeps affecting us today? So I'm saying all this because I hope, or I think the hope for having a colorblind society lies in first addressing the fact that we are a racialized social system, where the color of your skin is a factor in how decisions are made at both the institutional and personal levels of our society. So when I say colorblind racism, I'm referring to the idea as a socially constructed category, but with real consequences, where race is not a central factor in one's life or one's group's life chances, right? I mean, that's sort of the aim, right? And there's a level of reality that must be acknowledged, and that is that contrary to the wide perception that I think we still have, right, even in the last few years, politically, that we have been or we are a post-racial society, right? And the fact is that race still matters in the lives of many historically excluded and racially oppressed groups and individuals, and that racism is embedded in our institutions and societal structures in meaningful, very meaningful ways, right? And we see it, right? I mean, there's countless scholarship out there that talks about racial inequity affecting folks in the prison industrial complex, in our educational systems, in work, right? And all the things that sort of matter to people, right, in the US. So the question for me is whether it would be fair, even if it were possible and desirable, to now use colorblind and race-neutral policies when racial equality requires social and political changes that go beyond superficial equal access and treatment, right? And I think that's something we really need to sort of pay attention to. Further, pretending we are colorblind and removing racial categories without contending with current structural forms of racism will not lead to a just America, right? It will merely exacerbate racial discrimination in all its forms, and worse, we may no longer have the tools to identify racial disparities, right? So I do quite a bit of work, or at least my earlier, dissertation work, this is 20-something years ago now, has been looking at sort of diversity, right? And I was mentioning to sort of some fine folks earlier that I've really been against the kind of diversity movement, not against sort of a critical engagement with diversity, but the realities of what diversity has become, right? Not just sort of a commodified venture, but also sort of very symbolic. It's a very ambiguous term, right? And so it's really about tapping into whether or not you engage in kind of diversity policies and practices that will lead to real change, or whether it's actually more effective if you wanted real change to be very specific in targeting the type of change that you want. So if racism is without a doubt an issue on campus, then maybe you should be talking about dealing with racism on campus. If sexual harassment is an issue on campus, maybe you should be talking about sexual harassment. If issues of class, which I've been in institutions in which classism was very real, the dismantling of ACE programs and other such programs to sort of help disadvantaged students be supported and do well, right? If that's the issue on campus, right, then we should stop talking about sort of diversity practices or diversity policies and really be talking about, well, let's solve issues of class. So I think that's kind of the direction that I'm sort of still pushing for even 23 or 25 years sort of later, is what do we do with that, right? And I think it is, and this is really all couched in sort of really acknowledging that before we do anything, we really need to solve existing problems. The suggestion to move to a colorblind society, for example, and we can say it's theoretical, but it's really not, right? It's specifically in which the term race, and this is just one example, right, is not used, is not a theoretical act. We have data on societies who have chosen to pursue a colorblind state agenda, right? Societies such as Italy, France, Sweden. We have current scholarship in those countries that suggest that racism is actually worse, not better, right? So there's a group of scholars who have been writing on sort of France about French laws that prohibit the press from mentioning race or ethnicity, and they state, right, that they don't acknowledge race in their census, and writing about race or ethnicity is not allowed. But simply not talking about those issues doesn't mean those issues go away, right? It doesn't erase the issue. And so colorblind racial ideology, they would claim, or the beliefs, right, plays a role in the persistence of racism in France. And there's many other scholarships. We had my graduate class reading another book by Anne Morning and Marcella Maneri called An Ugly Word, Rethinking Race in Italy and the US. And the scholars find, right, that even though how race is thought about or used or not used in the different contexts between the US and Italy, the ideas, the stereotypes that are sort of deeply enmeshed in terms of how people think or categorize folks, right, based on those stereotypes as belonging, not belonging, as civilized or uncivilized, are still there. They don't really go away, right? So it's not that I think we should perhaps not pursue kind of eradication and having that kind of world that we want, but I think it really sort of pins or depends on sort of again, acknowledging that we need to deal with the existing forms of racism before we sort of move forward. And so I'll stop right there and let Brother Coleman. Thank you.
Down a little bit. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm I'm half Puerto Rican, so I was taught not to associate with Dominicans growing up, but I realized you guys aren't that kind of Dominican. And even if you were, it'd be okay. I want to talk first about a New York Times daily podcast that I listened to a few months ago. This was when affirmative action Supreme Court case was in the news. There was a tutor in New York City where I live who tutored many kids from Queens, many Asian kids from Queens in particular. Queens is the most diverse zip code in the country. And he was tutoring kids that were extremely motivated and anxious about getting into college. They were in the cycle that you all remember with the Common App and all the stress that comes with that. And what he said, and you should all go back and check this podcast out, he had a student, an Asian girl, who was listing all of the clubs that she did. She did math club, she did chess club, she did so on and so forth. And then she turns to him and she says, they're gonna know I'm Asian if I list all of these clubs. Can you help me make my application sound less Asian? And he said the first time he heard one of his students say that, it kind of shocked him and it saddened him that this girl was already conscious of how her race was going to affect her odds of getting into college negatively. And then he heard it with his next student. And then he heard it with the next student. And then he realized that all of the students applying to college already knew that the game was racially rigged and were trying to, essentially were having to lie as a result. Now, I would submit to you we're talking about justice here. That is a textbook case of injustice. It is exactly what Jewish students had to suffer in the 1930s and 40s and so forth when the Ivy League colleges thought that there were too many Jews, so forth. When I use the word colorblind, I don't mean pretend race doesn't exist. We all see race. We can't help it. When people say, I don't see race, I understand where that comes from. It's not true. We all see race. What's more, race can influence how we treat other people, maybe even subconsciously sometimes. It can influence how we're treated. All of that is valid conversation, important conversation. Even beyond that, reflecting on the ways in which your life has been lucky, however that manifests, whether it's as simple as being born in America, whether it's as simple as you were able to get out of a country and get here and others weren't, whether it's the fact that you were born upper middle class, whether it's the fact that you were born with certain gifts that other people don't have, all of that conversation broadly around privilege, it's all a very good thing. But when I say colorblindness, I mean that we should try our very best, and we won't do it perfectly, to treat people without regard to race, both in our personal lives and in our public policy. And you might say, what's so controversial about that, right? Even my quasi-opponent today sort of half agrees, which I'm glad to hear. It's become incredibly controversial. Best-selling author Ibram Kendi is considered one of the leading intellectuals on race right now. He says that the most dangerous movement in America is not white supremacy, but race neutrality. In other words, it's not the KKK and the far right that is the biggest threat. It's actually people that want a race-neutral system of laws and want to pursue a colorblind society. I could list many other examples of people that have been unlucky enough to say the word colorblind publicly and have had to publicly apologize, like Kristen Bell, the actress from that show, The Good Place, among many other things. She wrote a book called We Need More Purple People. It was a little, silly little kid's book where there's some red people and some blue people, and the moral of the story is you become purple people and everyone's happy, right? In a normal world, people wouldn't even notice. They'd, nice book. In our world, she was attacked online for the sin of colorblindness. Now she had to scramble to clarify. No. I would never promote colorblindness. This book was about, something else, right? This has happened over and over again. Happened to Bernie Sanders a few years ago, and so forth. There's a group of scholars which come from the field of critical race theory that have said colorblindness is not just wrong, it's white supremacy in disguise. Nothing could be further from the truth. Colorblindness, as I'm advocating for it today, was the animating ethos and philosophy of the civil rights movement. Go back and read Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait, and see what his proposal was for addressing the legacy of slavery in this country. It was not a regime of laws that looked at your race and treated you differently as a result. He argued that we should have an aggressive class-based anti-poverty program that was blind to race. Which brings me to my next point. Many people would agree, yes, treat your friends without regard to race, do your very best, at least, to do that. If you're hiring someone, don't, treat them based on their race. But how are we going to address the legacy of racism, legacy of slavery, et cetera, if we do not take race into account in our public policies, in our social policies? My argument is that anything you're trying to solve by taking race into account, you could solve better and more precisely by taking class into account. What do I mean by that? Imagine we were to pluck 10 people from America at random. And our task is to line them up by most privileged to least privileged. Which strategy would be better? A, we're going to put all the black people on the least privileged side, all the white people on the most privileged side, maybe the Hispanic people in between. And that's how we're going to rank. B, we're going to look at how much money was made in the house that you grew up in. And 0 will be on one end and millions will be on the other. And that's how we're going to rank you. Neither of these strategies is perfect, but I would submit that B is getting closer to what we really mean when we talk about disadvantage and what we're really trying to solve for when we craft our social policy, when we try to make the world a better place, when we try to account for the disparity in luck and advantage that people are born into. I'm under no illusions that we are actually going to get to a colorblind society, okay? Or rather, a perfectly colorblind society. I don't think it's possible. But notice, this would never be a counter-argument if we were talking about any other topic. In other words, if we were sitting here arguing about whether it would be just to move towards a peaceful society, say, I would say very much, yeah. Peace is it's the North Star that should guide us. But we're never going to get to a society with 0 violence, with 0 murders per year. It's not possible. However, it points in the right direction. My argument is that we'll never get to a perfectly colorblind society, and racism in the sense of prejudice, which is the definition I prefer, and we can get into that. Racism will never fully go away. There will always be certain people that want to denigrate and attack other races. However, colorblindness, the ideal of colorblindness, points us in the direction we should want to go. It points us in the direction that we should want to craft our public policy in, and it points in the direction that ultimately we should want to live our lives in. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can get to the next segment. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. So now I'll be eager to hear your responses to one another's statements. And we'll start with you, Dr. Embrick.
Hello. Thank you for that, Coleman. There's a lot that I agree with, and I won't dispute that. I think for me, we're trying to get to the same place, but it's how to do it, right? And I'm still sort of, I think where I struggle is that, for example, in your second comment where you say, you know, we should be thinking about class, we have the data that suggests when we separate out race and class, which is really hard to do because here's one of the things, right, that they're intertwined. The legacies and history of how folks of color, historically excluded and racially oppressed groups, are one that is situated on sort of the intersection of race and class, right? And so how do you sort of tease that out, right? And I think, you know, there was once a comment that was made on William Julius Wilson's book, The Declining Significance of Race, which is that, you know, it became really popular and a bunch of people sort of took off with it. And it really didn't completely explain his position because what he really probably should have titled it was The Increasing Significance of Class as opposed to The Decreasing Significance of Race, right? Because he didn't say that race didn't sort of matter, nor was it really going to be unimportant for us kind of looking in the future. Race still matters. The legacies and histories of racism in our country still matters, right? So you can talk about class and we can say class absolutely does matter. But when you start to look at things like wealth, right? When you start to look at things like, you know, segregated neighborhoods, when you start to look at things like how the legacies of racism has sort of affected folks' ability to buy property, right? And have that property sort of build equity and have that equity passed on from generation to generation, and that you have some groups that weren't able to get into the housing market until very recently because of things like, you know, banks redlining, right, or realtors blockbusting, right, or sort of all of these other sort of really overt racial policies at the time, although they've become sort of more covert, that you've got some groups that have sort of long history of making wealth, and they've been able to sort of capitalize on that wealth and build education and those kind of things. And you have some groups that are just now getting into sort of building that wealth, right? That's still with us, right? You can't really tease that out. You know, I spent 20-something years looking at issues of what I call diversity ideology, or sort of critical diversity within the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, right? And what I sort of come to realize is that, you know, unless you really sort of acknowledge, and some of these companies sort of do it superficially, I think symbolically, that you're sort of excluding certain groups, right? And with even some of these companies that are basically saying, well, maybe the problem is that we should basically sort of have these kind of race-neutral policies, or we should try not to talk about sort of that is going to, we know that decade after decade, like, the only thing that really happens is a maintaining of the status quo. Like if you look at these companies, they haven't really changed in terms of their gender or racial sort of demographics, right? And I think it's about terminology, right? So I've had, you know, a colleague who was coming out of grad school at the same time as me, and we were sort of talking or having a debate about sort of the dangers of kind of like moving from even diversity to inclusion, right? And inclusion is this really nice word. You hear it and you're like, oh yeah, we should be all inclusive, right? And so what she was studying was really about how companies kind of have divorced themselves from diversity language because they really wanted inclusion language, what was really happening was there was sort of a push or a movement within these companies, mostly by white men who occupied 80% of the population, that were really upset about current diversity policies, which were very few resources set up as a fund to basically recruit and retain people of color or women, right? But by dismantling that very small amount of money, the one thing that they sort of suggested overtly to the rest of the public that was going to happen, that didn't happen, was it became even more white, more male-centered, because now there was nothing that sort of presented the status quo, right? And so as Leland Sato has sort of written in his book on race-neutral policies, there really aren't anything such as race-neutral policies. Now, again, I sort of stand by, like, I think we can get there, but I think it's a bandage approach that doesn't really do anything unless we really sort of address the issues that are at hand. And I look at it structurally, not individually, right? So it's a different perspective, I think, coming all together. I think I ran out of time. I was keeping an eye on the clock this time.
5 minutes from earlier.
Oh.
So we'll hear from Mr. Hughes, but please start sharing some questions that you may have at this point, whatever has come up for you. As you'll see when you click in, you'll have the option to choose whether you'd like to direct your question to Dr. Embrick or Mr. Hughes or both. And so hopefully we'll get a great selection of questions, and we'll start asking in a moment. But first, Mr. Hughes, what were your reflections on the opening statement from Dr. Embrick?
Let me see if I can take this out. So I guess you said a lot of things. I don't quite know where to start, but I guess I'll start with the listing of America's sins with respect to race, which always happens in this conversation. I'm sure we could both do it, and you gave a little bit of it, redlining and a million other things. Nobody at this point, nobody serious denies that has had a long shadow. The question is, what is the right way to respond to it? Now, I think implied, but not outright stated in your approach, is that the right way to respond to it is with race-based policies that are broadly aimed at sort of undoing those effects, even if that means discriminating against individuals in the present based on their race, if that's in a kind of reverse direction, undoing history, as it were. If I'm putting words in your mouth, I apologize, but that seems to me sort of implied by your answer. What I would say is nobody can minimize the racism and white supremacy that was the norm throughout the vast majority of American history. However, I think the constructive way to move forward is not with policies that discriminate against people on the basis of skin color in some opposite direction. Now, I want to give a concrete example of this because I think it's important to be concrete. During the pandemic, restaurants were struggling. I don't remember the number now, but there's at one point like 30% of restaurants in the country were basically on the verge of going. And government wanted to solve this problem, understandably, and so set aside $28 billion to help restaurants, survive. But rather than do this on the basis of how much money each restaurant needed, which is information the government had. In other words, they had the difference between your revenue this year and last year, so they can recoup you for the pandemic loss, essentially. Rather than do it on that basis, the way they designed it was that everyone except for white men comes to the front of the line, and white men were at the back of the line. This actually happened. It's called the Restaurant Revitalization Program. You can look up the New York Times articles on it and so forth. Now, without a doubt, there were people that happened to be white men that, because of their race in this particular instance, did not get that money and lost their restaurant as a result. And if you want to know the truly ironic and sad twist to the end of the story, once 2/3 of the money was already gone, many lawsuits from those white men came in alleging discrimination, which it was. A court stopped the program and then ordered them to reverse it and only give it to those white men, right? So in the intermediate period between the halting of the money and the dispersal, there were several thousand people of color and women that were promised the money, that got the email saying your restaurant's going to survive, and then were unpromised it. The end result being that thousands of white men were discriminated against, thousands of people of color and women were discriminated against and left in the lurch. And all of this could have been avoided if from the beginning it had been a race-neutral program on either a first-come, first-served basis, or a program that asked, how much money has your restaurant lost? Don't need to know your skin color, no thanks. And we will reimburse you to that extent. All of this could have been avoided. And instead it was a program that left thousands of people feeling the sting of racial discrimination, which, if the history of Black America shows us anything, is that people do not forget it. And that's why I think it's important to be concrete about these programs, because, you know, abstractly, it can sound like a very wise thing to do. And then when you see how the sausage gets made, it becomes very tempting, and I think right, to say, we have to get out of this business. We have to find a way to address disparities of privilege, disparities of income, and so forth, without creating yet more understandable anger on the part of people for being racially discriminated against. And so I don't at all disagree with your listing of America's sins or the importance of that, but I do disagree with the approach that you imply.
We're not gonna go back and forth? No, I'm joking.
Yeah, you still have
No, I did-
leftover time.
no, it's just a quick response. Is that I don't know that that's what I implied, and if I did, I'm sorry that it was probably interpreted that way. But my point was really that there are many ways to sort of go about it, right? What usually ends up in a conversation like this is one end always goes to the extreme about, well, what about sort of the reverse discrimination or those kind of things that happen. My point is that those type of, like, if we don't take into account the continued legacies of racism, and here we're forgetting, or at least I don't think we should forget, that racism hasn't gone away. Like, redlining still happens, blockbusting still, those things still happen. Like, they're not gone away. They're not like legacies in history, right? Racial discrimination is alive and well, right? And so the not addressing current issues, right, leads to continued further discrimination between other groups. I mean, we're talking about sort of, you know, what about the whataboutism? Like, what about these folks that are sort of losing out, or these folks losing out? And I'm like, well, if you continue the status quo, then you're what about everybody else, right? So I think that's the issue that I'm at. So how do we sort of get to a point where we sort of recognize, and that's why I said it's important to recognize that racism continues, and I think you would agree. I mean, you even said, like, right, race still matters, and so addressing that should be part of the equation as we move forward. I want to sneak over and get my water. Can I?
Cross, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, we have got a great spectrum of questions here, so we'll go through as many as we can, and I encourage you to keep sending them. I'm going to start with this question. I'm going to direct it to Dr. Embrick, though in general, I'm eager to hear either of you address any of the questions that come up, but I'm going to send it to you based on something you said earlier, I think. Do you think that the diversity culture in corporate America is in effect a fraud? This person says, I'm a Latino finance major, and I keep seeing recruiting companies pushing this idea that they are very diverse. Your questions have made me skeptical of what is actually taking place.
Oh, is that part of the question we're supposed to?
It was related.
Should I open up that door?
Yeah.
I would hope, this is where I'm sort of trying to be skeptical rather than cynical, that that doesn't apply broadly. But I've done a ton of research in there, and I can tell you, like, again, when I say diversity has become sort of a hot commodity, right? I mean, I think folks, businesses, institutions are in the business of diversity, either, well, mostly symbolically, right? So you don't have to really do much digging into a company's history to see if there's been any real change from time A to time B to time C to time D. And I've been doing this long enough where I can tell you, like, you can have the Walmarts of the world. Am I allowed to call out names? Walmarts of the world that have hundreds and hundreds of diversity awards, from Diversity Inc. to Diversity That. And at the same time, they're not, if you look at mid-management and above, right, and you're looking at sort of CEOs and CDOs and senior administration officers, you won't find a lot of people of color or women in those positions, right? And so, again, there could be many reasons, but you have to sort of at least you have to be skeptical about why that is, right? And at the same time that Walmart gets these awards, they also get tons of racial and gender discrimination lawsuits coming at them. So it's like, what's going on here, right? And they're not I mean, I'm just picking on them for whatever, but you know, there's a lot of institutions that are like that, right? It's almost like remember when we were having a conversation about diversity sort of at universities, and there was a couple of universities that got caught because, you know, they have very few people of color, and all of a sudden, like, they're advertising like they're very racially diverse. They don't say racially diverse, they say diverse. And then you look at some of these photos and it's like, wait a minute, that's the same person like 20 times. Like, what their face is on there, like, they're on everything, like, right? And that's, right, they're hoping that people don't catch that. I mean, that's intentional, right? I mean, that you can't not, like, that's not by accident, right? And so what's going on and what you're trying to sort of pitch. And again, I don't know the reasons without having talked to sort of the folks that are there, but yeah, it's become an issue. I would be skeptical.
You have any thoughts on that?
I think diversity is like love. If it happens naturally, it's beautiful. But if it's forced, you've somewhat missed the whole point. I think a lot of institutions have tried to force diversity where it isn't happening on its own and have created an enormous amount of friction as a result. I come from the music world. I know a lot of people in the comedy world. They happen to be diverse spaces in a way that is unforced, and that's beautiful. When you try to force it, this often creates friction. Now, it's the pious thing to say today is that diversity is basically a sacred value. It cannot be questioned. It must be good by definition. Do we really believe this? I don't know if we really believe this. Half my family went to historically black colleges and universities, not very diverse spaces. These are all black colleges. They had a great experience. Nobody thinks that Earth, Wind, and Fire needed a white person in there, or that the Beatles needed a Hispanic. This is, to me, diversity, like I said, when it happens, it's amazing because everyone gets enriched. But just because it's amazing and beautiful does not mean it should be forced by any means. And I think what happens, part of what we're seeing happening is because of the George Floyd protests and riots in 2020 and people responding to that, companies really wanted to respond to that. They hired, spent much more on diversity, equity, and inclusion, so forth, hired lots of black and Hispanic people, promoted people, et cetera. Now that that moment has died, those people are the first out the door because it wasn't a real commitment. The people paying lip service to it, I think deep down didn't believe it. And I think a lot of those people are beginning to feel betrayed now. And I've talked to some people in this situation because they were made to feel quite important in 20 and 21, 2020 and 21. And now that the moment's over, it's like they don't even remember your name. So I think I don't mean to be only provocative when I do mean to provoke, but in the good way. To what extent is diversity really sacred? What do we really mean by that?
I can dig most of what you said. The last part sort of struck me really well, because I think the difference maybe between us is that I never go into looking at diversity thinking that companies or institutions really care about diversity in the first place. So for me, it's symbolic, right? And the proof is there, right? The idea that we see, the aftermath of George Floyd in these positions is not new. These are peaks and troughs. I mean, Sharon Collin wrote about this in the 1970s when companies started hiring, and they used to be called multicultural offices, right? And then by the 1980s, those were all dismantled. So we see these in the institutions as they sort of come and go, right? Which tells me, but for me, the interesting thing out of all of this historically is do they really want change, right? And it's about opportunities, right? I'm not saying displacement, but I'm saying that when you sort of maintain the status quo, what you're also doing is you're reducing opportunities, right? So some of the examples that you gave, for sure, right? I mean, we're not going to have people having bands and things like that. But when you're talking about sort of large corporate, or other institutions where it's really a public right, like educational institutions, and maybe not so much in private universities, but certainly if you look at a place like UConn, which is where I'm at, I'm tenured, so I think I could say this, maybe, who knows. We're a land-grant institution. We're supposed to serve the state of Connecticut. That's the whole state. It's not just part of the state. That includes Hartford all the way to Storrs and everything in between, which is pretty much nothing. And the fact that we don't is problematic, right? And so how do you sort of deal with, how do you really sort of address that? But not addressing it means that there's not going to be any sort of change in that direction, right?
On the other hand, if you receive public money, then you can't violate the 14th Amendment or civil rights law in your effort to increase diversity. You run the risk of violating civil rights laws by discriminating on the basis of race.
But they do that all the time.
Right, but
right. You know what I'm saying? We have data from there's Ted Thornhill. There's company of folks that talk about sort of the inequities that are built into the admissions process that people will deny, but the proof is right there. So it's like it's already being done, and we're like, well, we shouldn't change that because it's going to disrupt X, Y, and Z. I mean, what they're really saying is we want to maintain the status quo. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying we should question it.
So let me make, one more quick point on that.
Yeah.
I know we have to get to the next questions.
We're going to get the audience.
Abolish the SAT. This is the fashionable thing. Many schools have already done it. This doesn't make much sense to me. I think this does the opposite of what people claim it does. When you abolish the SAT, now the entire way you get into school is based on all the other stuff. Now, what are the other stuff? Extracurriculars, essays that you pretend you wrote, but really your parents wrote. All this other stuff, right? If you take that bundle of stuff, who is best able to do really well on that stuff? Well, it's the kids that come from money, the kids that know all the tutors that are going to write the essays for you, the kids that have time to do 12 different extracurricular programs because they're resourced and go to nice private high schools like the one I went to. My mother grew up in the South Bronx, and she was only identified as bright because she did well on a test. She didn't have any extracurriculars. Both parents were illiterate, couldn't help her write an essay. So I only say this because you mentioned inherent inequities in the recruitment process. I think we are creating one And it's broadly the people on your side of this argument that are fighting to get rid of the standardized tests. I think it's backwards.
All right, I've got a ton of questions for each of you, so this one is for you, Mr. Hughes. Couldn't
Doctor, do I have a PhD?
Yeah, you just got a
Oh.
promotion, yeah.
Wait, honorary from Providence. Okay, I'm putting that in the bank.
Couldn't not treating someone in regard to their race be disrespectful in some cases? For some people, their race is a key part of their identity, so it would be ignoring part of who they are.
Yeah. So when I say colorblind, I don't mean culture blind. And this is where it gets tricky. If you tell me that you are Jewish and that's an important part of your identity, great. If you tell me you are Finnish, this is an important part of your identity. That's your ethnicity, right? I guess not a race, but the thing in America, it's interesting because being black is both a race and a culture. It's a racial group that describes anyone descended from Africa, but it's also a cultural ethnic group specific to America. So black can equally describe someone descended from American slavery and someone from Ethiopia that has almost nothing in common with them. And that's like the racial definition of black. But then there's also this common history, common culture of the African descendants of slaves in America that have a distinct story from other black people throughout the world. So if you're talking about that second concept of race, for instance, as someone's identity, I see that as akin to someone saying, hey, I'm Jewish and that's important to me. Hey, I'm Venezuelan, that's important to me. Now that's fine to have a personal story and to appreciate and celebrate those cultural differences, to learn about them. You know, I'm not coming for your school assembly on Juneteenth or Black History Month or Diwali or that stuff is all great. I'm against the policies which discriminate on the basis of those variables, and I think we should all make our best effort while celebrating those cultural differences to not discriminating on the basis of them.
Dr. Embrick, what do you feel is the best way to address racism at predominantly white institutions in situations where most of the staff and those who have the power over decisions are white and will not protect the students of color?
What? So tell me that again. So what?
Yeah. What do you feel is the best way to address racism at PWI institutions in situations where most of the staff and those who have the power over decisions are white and will not protect students of color?
I mean, if you took that last part out, I could play around with it. I think that's an issue, right? I think that yeah, I mean, you're going to lead me down a potential rabbit hole because if the administration and the staff and the faculty don't want change, it's not going to happen, right? And so, you know, it's really student directive movements that's going to make that change, I think, right? I mean, I don't know that I've run into that, or at least, I mean, I know what you're saying, or at least the person who's asking the question is saying, because I think there is what senior administration often, and faculty and staff often say, versus the reality of what they do, right? And that's different. From my vantage point, if you want real change in institutions, you have to look at institutional change and systemic change and structural changes as opposed to individual changes. I'm not saying that you take that away from the equation, but I'm saying that's how you sort of get change, right? So I've done workshops for universities that ask me to come in and do implicit bias training, and that's fine. I'm sort of against implicit bias training when it's by itself, but as part of a larger equation that includes the implicit bias part as well as the structural changes, I think that's where change can happen, right? So if you ask me to come in and you're only interested in implicit bias and you want individuals to do the Harvard implicit bias test or whatever, right? I mean, that makes it easy, I think, for institutions to deflect responsibility, right? So yeah, a person said this, a person did this, so we get rid of that person, we blame that person, but we don't talk about sort of all the other issues that happen on historically white colleges or universities, right? Or either other colleges, right? So the sense of belonging, how do I sort of get, how do I see sort of people that represent myself or that have contributed to the university? How do I see sort of change in the curriculum, right? Why, do I see people who look like me who have contributed in these disciplines? Like those type of changes that need to sort of happen. But I'm not too sure. I mean, it's a hard question, right? Because you premised it with these people don't want change. So it's like, I wouldn't go there. I don't know.
This is this is in the same ballpark, Mr. Hughes. If we do not force diversity, how can we ever reach a just society? Do you think that it's okay if some companies, jobs, et cetera, are not diverse by any means? Or, presumably that they're not, that diversity is not a stated goal.
I would turn it back to the questioner and ask, are you keeping a consistent set of books? And I live in New York, and when I go to any deli in Harlem, everyone who works there is Yemeni. I like to talk to them. They have interesting stories. But they're not hiring in a colorblind way. They're hiring in a deeply ethnic way. I'm not saying corporations have the right to do that or ought to do that. I'm saying that what is actually the ideal here? What is actually justice? Is justice every company in the world having to be a rainbow? That's one conception of justice, and then once it's there, you can do anything you want to get there, right? Then the ends justify the means, no matter how much friction that creates. Personally, I would never want to be hired by someone that was hiring me on the basis of my skin color, that would not have hired an identical applicant of a different race. I don't want to be brought into a company in that way. I don't claim to speak for all Black or Hispanic people, all people of color. I would, however, highlight that there is something about being brought in for attributes other than for attributes you have no control over that I think leads to racial tension, encourages it. In other words, if I invite you to my house and I say, part of the reason I'm inviting you in is because you're Asian, that gives you a mindset that, okay, well, I guess what I bring to the table is my Asianness. So now I have to inject that into all my work, and then you wonder why people have racial tensions in such situations. So for me, a just society is not one in which every company reflects the US Census in terms of its racial diversity. That's never been the case anywhere. I don't think we'll ever have that be the case. A just society is one where we keep inching towards a situation where no matter where you are born, you have a level of opportunity that is not hindered by your racial identity. What you make of it is what you make of it. But I do not like this paint by numbers approach to justice whereby we are just only insofar as every college, every corporation, Black people are 13% of the population. Well, they got to be 13% of that school, 13% of that YMCA, 13%, regardless of what the local demographics are. I mean, this is a recipe for socially engineered madness, not for justice.
I'm going to ask one more question. About 6 people sent it in. It is a very hard question, so I'm going to whoever would like to start is welcome to. What are your thoughts on affirmative action in the college admission process? Do you think it is just and/or effective way to address racism?
Well, it will surprise nobody that I do not think it is just or an effective way to attack racism. I think it is itself racist, as conveyed by the story I told. Like I said, I'd be interested to see what people are able to do with class-based affirmative action and so forth. Race-based affirmative action, in my view, it's been on borrowed time since the beginning. It made a lot more sense in the late 1960s and 70s, where almost everyone in the country was either black or white, and black people were, single-digit number of years away from fully being able to vote and so forth. But it was never intended to be a permanent policy. It was never part of the agenda of the civil rights movement to have a race-based regime of admissions. And it created tension right from the start because the entire civil rights movement was premised, and I know some people will deny this, and I would vigorously disagree, was premised on the philosophy of colorblindness and meritocracy and equal rights. And when they were debating the Civil Rights Act on the Senate floor, the lead sponsor of the bill, because this was a Jim Crow talking point against the Civil Rights Act, was, you blacks, you don't really want equality. You're going to make us discriminate in favor of you. That was the Jim Crow talking point against the Civil Rights Act. And the lead sponsor of the Civil Rights Act said on the Senate floor, if there is a single sentence of this act that requires anyone to discriminate in favor of a person of color for any reason on any basis that is anything other than colorblind, I will eat the entire bill page by page on the Senate floor in front of you. Okay? The co-sponsor of the bill literally called it colorblind, to use the word. And you read the bill today, it completely is. That was the goal of the civil rights movement, and it was the reasons why things like race-based affirmative action evolved out of that is complicated and for another time. But I really do think we have to go back to that vision. It's been enough time at this point, and we are simply creating more quietly disgruntled victims of racial discrimination the longer we keep policies like this. The time is never going to be perfect to say year zero, but today is as good as it's ever going to get.
I think it's a heated question. I'm sure people probably won't be surprised equally that I'm probably for affirmative action, but I will say this, right? And I'll say it this way: there's a lot of assumptions that are made, and a lot of people don't know what affirmative action is. I think there's assumptions made in terms of higher education. There's assumptions made in corporate America. There's assumptions that are made that affirmative action equals quotas. There's assumptions that are made that most universities have affirmative action programs. Like UConn doesn't have an affirmative action program, right? Affirmative action was meant, and I think it has been beneficial to some groups. It's been beneficial to white women, who sort of has been able to sort of use affirmative action, and no one speaks about that. It's sort of left off completely and not in the discussion. That's why you have colleges and universities and corporations, right? Affirmative action has not, right? I mean, if you look at kind of like the battle against affirmative action, it's been under target for a long time. That's not just recent, right? And so affirmative action, the idea that somebody is taking someone else's position, I think is partially a myth, right? You might have some examples out there, but what has sort of spread It's kind of like the Horatio Algiers kind of like, you know, a story that's happened and then it's kind of spread like, oh my God, like I didn't get into school because of someone else, when the reality is you don't know, right? What folks never talk about when they start, when I hear students that are saying, I didn't get into UConn because, you know, somebody took my position or whatever, like something like that. I'm just using an analogy here. They don't ever say, like, I didn't get in because of these other white people got in, right? And so there's all these assumptions that are made, and they're made basically on sort of a racial basis, right? I know I didn't get in. I should have gotten in, and how dare, like, there's got to be a black person out there that got in because there's no way they would have got in because of affirmative action, right? I mean, so again, even at UConn where we don't have those policies, I've heard students, I've had conversations with students that have been told that they've overheard X, Y, and Z talk about how they must have got in because of affirmative action, because of the right? When none of that is really true in the first place, and no one knows anything about, right? So I think we have to sort of be careful about making all of these assumptions. My thing is like, again, I don't see it as working. I don't think it has worked. So that's a different reason from approaching it. I do think that, and this is where I don't, maybe I'll partially agree with you, but I think if you're not, and this is where maybe this is a different conversation than I've had with other people, is if you're gonna poo-poo affirmative action, then for me, it would be useful if you come up with other policies that would be just, right? That would deal with the current issue, right? Because the truth of the matter is you can take it doesn't take a whiz, you can take a look at any of these institutions and see that the status quo is there, right? They're not, the change is not happening, right? Whether it's intentional or not. So if you're going to poo-poo it, then what else can you come up with that's actually going to make change? And maybe that is a class base, I don't know, right? But I don't see people coming forward. I mean, usually what happens is people are like, no, we're against it, right? Well, now it's gone. So what are you going to do? We're just going to leave it status quo? What are you going to do? What are we going to do to make that change? What's the next step? And before this happened, people were just kind of like, I don't know, but we got to do something. Well, that's not an answer.
There is a reception in the great room next door. I hope you will all come and continue the conversation there. I want to thank our speakers one more time for a great conversation.